Hello guys, welcome back. Now today we're going to be talking about women's hockey and if women should play in today's NHL. Now with Coyne and Decker both shining in the NHL All-Star Game and with the women's programs and women's leagues getting better and better every day, the question must be asked, can women play and should they play in today's NHL? Now this NHL All-Star Weekend was filled with a ton of highlights. There was a lot of things to like, but I feel like with that weekend, the biggest highlight was when Coyne Schofield and Brianna Decker were both a part of the skills competition, doing something that has never been done before. Now for context, with this NHL All-Star Game weekend, the NHL invited 4 women's hockey players to come and participate in the festivities, and they also invited 2 USA women's players that won gold with the USA team in the Olympics last year, and one of them was Kendall Coyne, who was a part of the fastest skater competition. She was actually the first women's player ever to be in any of the events in the NHL skills competition, so she was breaking big barriers, and we saw something that we still have never seen before, so it was a big honor for her, and I'm glad we got to see it. And the other USA women's player, her name was Brianna Decker. She was a part of the passing competition, and she actually won the thing. She was like 6 seconds ahead of the winner, that was Leon Draisaitl. He ended up winning, but the actual winner was Brianna Decker. She got the best time in the competition, but apparently she was just participating. She wasn't a part of the actual competition, so the NHL didn't pay her outright, but then CCM ended up paying her the $25,000 that she would have gotten if she actually got the money from the NHL. But both women's players were honestly amazing. Kendall Coyne was amazing in the skating competition, and Brianna Decker won the passing competition against elite NHLers. So they both stepped up to the opportunity. Both women had great opportunities there, and they both were fantastic, and I bet it was a lot of fun for them, and it was big milestones for women's hockey in general. But this sort of event would have never happened 5 or even 10 years ago. With the women's game, it's been really growing over the last few years. We've seen a lot of great talented women's players come up and play well. And of course, with the Olympics, we saw USA win gold last year, which is a big testament to Canada, which was always the team to beat when it came to women's hockey. So it's really in a good direction when it comes to women's hockey. It's still not where it needs to be when it comes to funding and overall talent. But when it comes to women's hockey, it's getting a lot better and is starting to rival the men's group, even if the men are always more talented. But while the women's players were certainly very impressive in the NHL skills competition, would they be able to play and compete in an NHL regular season game? Now, I first want to start off by saying we would have never had this conversation 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it might be. But with the women's game, it's been very much a growth spurt. With the women's game, we saw the NWHL being founded in 2015. We've seen immense growth when it comes to the women's game, development programs. We've seen a lot of steps forward to getting that development program where it needs to be. So while we never would have had this conversation, I'm glad that we're having it now, and that just shows how much the women's game has grown over the last few years. And with the NWHL, that league alone has sparked a lot of interest into the women's game. We've seen some teams really gain a lot of interest from casual hockey fans. We've seen a lot of people gather towards women's hockey because of that league being founded a few years ago. And because of that, we've seen a lot more interest in women's hockey. We've seen a lot more sponsors and a lot more money coming into the women's game. And that's great to see. And even though it probably won't compete up to the NHL and all those men leagues, it's great to see that the NWHL is standing for itself, and we're seeing that the women's game is really growing, especially over the last 5 years. But with the women's game growing so much, and we've seen a lot of talented women's players come up and play well, I think this is a discussion that we need to have with ourselves. If women's players can make it in the NHL someday, if they can make it now. And I feel like it is a pretty heated debate because you could go either way, but to me, I feel like I'm kind of leading in the middle here. Now, when it comes to the overall talent level of women's hockey and with some of the women's players, I think some of the women's players, when it comes to talent, can definitely match up to select NHL players. I think a player like Hillary Knight could be in a lot of top 6s in the NHL when it comes to skill. But when it comes to overall game, the NHLers and the men obviously have that advantage. We've seen that in the past. But when it comes to overall skill, I feel like the women are starting to really catch up to the men. Maybe not completely, but I feel like these superstars in the NWHL and in the Women's League could certainly be in an NHL lineup today. But let's just pick a random team like LA, for example. You can't tell me that Hilary Knight is a bad player on LA. While Hilary Knight is not an all-around player when it comes to contact and physicality, when it comes to talent, Hilary Knight would blow a lot of those players out of the water, especially on a team like LA or Ottawa or whatever bad team you want to name. When it comes to some of the select women's players, while a lot of them probably wouldn't be able to catch up to the NHL or be good enough to make the NHL, I feel like with some of the select stars in the women's league, they can maybe survive. And while the game is still physical, when it comes to talent level, I think they can still compete. And with Kendall Coyne and Brianna Decker, what they were able to do in the skills competition, at least skill-wise, to be comparable to some of those NHL players in those select skill competitions. While it is still the NHL All-Star Game and it is still the NHL skills competition, some of those NHL players aren't giving 100%. It was still amazing to see those women's players give it their all and be competitive against some of the most talented players in the entire world. And seeing a girl like Brianna Decker pretty much win the passing skills competition, it was amazing to see that. So when it comes to skill, I feel like select women's players can be able to match up. It's just about which ones can actually do it. But let's just say we put half of the NWHL into the NHL. I feel like a lot of those women's players would have a tough time transitioning. When it comes to women, most of the time they are a lot smaller than men when it comes to overall size, weight, and height. But with men, they always have the advantage there when it comes to physicality and the overall strength, at least most of the time. So the women would already have a disadvantage there. But when it comes to one of the more skilled players, like a Hilary Knight, they could definitely survive. And Hilary Knight is not a small person by any means. I think she's 5'11", so she could definitely hold her own in the NHL, and that's why I think Hilary Knight could maybe have a chance. But for other players like Kendall Coyne, for instance, she's 5'2", and I don't think that would really survive in today's NHL. But with Kendall Coyne and Brianna Decker, it was amazing to see them dominate those NHL skills competitions and seeing them play very, very well. But with the NHL today, while it is heading in a more skillful direction, it still has a lot of physicality. There's still a lot more than just passing and skating. And for the NHL right now, it still is in that position of being more of a physical game and being one of the more physical games in the world. So even though the NHL is heading in that skillful direction, I feel like honestly a lot of women's players will be absolutely brutal in the NHL right now if they were to put it in today. And women and women's hockey players also just have the disadvantage of being less physically able than most men. And that's just a biology thing. That's just what happens. But for a lot of these skillful women's players, for even the elite women's players, it would still be hard, I think, for them to transition into the men's game. Because with most women programs and with most women's leagues, they've been grown up in no-contact sporting for no-contact hockey. And going straight into the NHL would be something that for a lot of women's players, they can't adapt to. And for me right now, I feel like if a women's player, especially a forward or defenseman, were to come into the NHL, it would take a little bit of time for that to happen and a lot of adaptability from the NHL. But for me personally, when it comes to the first woman to play in a regular season game, it's going to take quite a while for that to happen, but I think it's going to be especially hard for the forwards and defensemen to be able to make that happen. With most women, unless you're like a Hilary Knight, you're usually a lot less strong, you're a lot less tall, and you're a lot less beefy than most men, and that's already a disadvantage. And while some women's players are super skilled, I feel like in today's NHL, unless things change, unless the NHL bans hitting or bans fighting, I feel like for that to happen, it would take quite a bit of change from the NHL to just change the game in general to make accommodate for those women's players. But for me personally, I feel like the skill is no problem whatsoever. I feel like skill-wise, a lot of these women's players could definitely match up with even bottom 6 NHL players. I feel like that could definitely happen. But with all the other areas of the game right now, with all the other areas in NHL hockey right now, that would be very hard for a lot of the women's players to adapt to and to play well in. So for me personally, I feel like this skill is definitely there for the women's players, but they just aren't used to that hard-hitting, hard-nosed game that the NHL plays today. Now, for me personally, I feel like it will be quite a while before we see a woman step into an NHL game. For me personally, I feel like it will probably take at least 10 or 15 years before we see something like that. But I feel like change is already coming in the NHL to accommodate that. We've seen a lot more skill, a lot more speed, and with these women's players, they already showed that they can do that. They already showed that they can skate. They already showed that they can pass like some of the elite NHL players. So when it comes to skill, there's definitely no problem. But again, the physicality comes into the game, and that's where they kind of lag behind. And there's also going to be quite a barrier for even the most skilled women's players to even make an NHL roster. Right now, even though things are getting better, there's still a lot of sexist people in the NHL today that would say, oh, and they're just complete trash. They're not even hockey players, they're just women. And for stuff like that, I don't even want to waste time on those people. But even then, I feel like having that barrier of just the people in the front offices is going to be a big challenge for a lot of those women's hockey players. But while women have the disadvantage of physicality, they have the disadvantage of maybe front office sexism, they might have the disadvantage of overall ability, I feel like we will see an NHL player that is a woman someday. I'm going to predict that in the next 30 years, we will see a women's player. It won't be a forward, it won't be a defenseman, but I feel like we'll see a goalie make a regular season appearance, at least one appearance in the next 30 years, and that's something that I pretty much believe in right now. Now, I say regular season because there was actually one woman to play in an exhibition preseason game back in 1992. Her name was Maiden Ramin, and she was a goaltender for the Tampa Bay Lightning and ended up playing, I think, in a couple of games in a couple of years for the Tampa Bay Lightning in the preseason. And while she didn't play in the regular season, it was still a big moment for women's hockey and to break that barrier. So while it wouldn't be the first women's player to play in the NHL, I feel like there's still that barrier of playing in the regular season that has a lot of people shying away from it. And this is how it all factors into my opinion of the goal of a goalie being the first women's player to play an NHL regular season game. For me, it'll be exponentially more hard for a forward or defenseman to break that women's barrier than it would be if it was a goaltender. For goaltenders right now, yes, you have a lot of technicalities when it comes to skating, when it comes to physicality, but I feel like with goaltenders, they avoid a lot of that physicality that a forward or defenseman would take, and for goaltenders, it just takes a lot of skill, and I feel like the skill is the most important part, and even though that is the biggest part of forwards and defensemen, when it comes to goaltenders, I feel like it'll be a much more easier transition for a lot of women's players to play in major leagues and to play in the NHL, and I feel like that's why a goaltender will be the first. Now, that is not to say that a forward or defenseman could not make the women's debut in the NHL, but I feel like with goaltenders, they have a lot less of a problem on their hands when it comes to the physicality. That is something that a women's forward or defenseman is going to have to deal with every single shift, every single play. But with goaltenders, it's a lot more about size, it's a lot more about technicalities, and it's a lot more about skill in general. And for the goaltenders, they for the most part, do not have to deal with the physicality of the NHL and the physicality of the game of hockey. And I feel like that's why we'll see the goaltender make the first appearance when it comes to women's, and I feel like in the next 3 years, we will see it happen. But let's just say in the next 10 years that the NHL outlaws hits, or they outlaw fights, or they outlaw physicality. That will make a big window for women's hockey and for women's players to potentially make the NHL and to play well. As I said before, I feel like a lot of women's players have the talent to stack up against quite a few great NHL players, or quite a few NHL players. And I feel like for women's hockey, if they get rid of that, if they get rid of the fighting, if they get rid of the physicality, that would just open up the floodgates. But for me, a lot of the women's players have that barrier of not really being used to that fighting and hitting culture, and I feel like that is something that is going to be a big swing point in the next few years to determine what really happens. But that barrier of women's players making the NHL is something that I for sure want to be alive to see, and it's something that I'm looking forward to, the day that it ends up happening. And while I don't think the NHL will ever be outnumbered by women, I don't think that is ever going to happen. I feel like with the NHL, there's room and opportunity for women to play in the NHL someday, and that's something that I hope to see, and before I die, I'm hoping to see. And for me personally, it would just be something cool to see. And even at that point, if there's an NHL player, if there's a women's player that plays in the NHL, if by then the NBA hasn't had a women's player, or if the NFL hasn't had a women's player, or if the MLB hasn't had the women's player, it would be a big PR stunt for the NHL, and it would do wonders for the overall NHL when it comes to attention. And that would be amazing for the NHL, it would be amazing for their pockets, and it would be amazing for fans like me that actually want to see it happen. But to me, the biggest thing that is a deterrent away from women's players right now in the NHL is the physicality. I mean, we saw in the skills competition, Kendall Coyne and Brianna Decker, they were both able to compete against quality NHL players in the skills competitions, and that alone was very, very impressive. So for me, the skill is definitely on par for NHL rosters. I feel like a lot of them have the skill to make it, but the big barrier right now is the physicality and how rough it would be on most of the women's players' bodies. And for me personally, I feel like once the physicality goes down and maybe once we see fighting or maybe hitting out a lot, I feel like that will be a big opportunity for a lot of women's players to make the jump and to play well in the NHL, because right now it is going towards a more skill league and a lot of the women's players do have that skill. But of course, with this video, I want to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comments down below. I know this is a pretty heated topic and a pretty heated discussion, so again, I want to hear your thoughts. Please be respectful, and again, I want to know, what do you agree about this topic? What do you think about it? Do you think women should play in today's NHL? What do you think about Kendall Coyne and Brianna Decker playing in the skills competition? And do you think there's room for women's players to play in the NHL, or do you think they should stick in their own league? But if you guys want some more grab videos just like this one, you can click on this card right here to watch my thoughts on the PK Subban's new NHL show. But that is going for today, guys. If you guys did enjoy, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already. Again, comment down below your thoughts on the women's hockey right now and if they could play in the NHL today. And I'll see you guys in the next video or stream. Goodbye.